my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker, Vijay Prashad. Dr. Prashad is an historian, journalist, political commentator, and Marxist intellectual. He's the author of 25 books. In 2012, he published 5 books, including Arab Spring, Libyan Winter, Uncle Swami, South Asians in America Today. His book, The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World, was chosen as the best nonfiction book by the Asian American Writers Workshop in 2008 and won the Muzaffar Ahmed Book Award in 2009. In 2013, Verso published his The Poorer Nations, A Possible History of the Global South. He's also author of No Free Left, The Future of Indian Communism, and he's editor of Letters to Palestine, and that's an edited collection that includes the writings of Tiju Cole, Sinan Antoon, Noura Erakat, and Junot Diaz. His most recent book is Red Star Over the Third World. Dr. Prashad also writes for Frontline, The Hindu, Alternet, and Burgun. Each Friday, he writes a column called Radical Journeys for NewsClick. He's reported from around the world for the Indian media from Latin America to the Middle East to Africa. And he is an advisory board member of the U.S. campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel, which is part of the global BDS movement. He currently serves as executive director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and is chief editor of Leftward Books. Please join me in welcoming Vijay.
Hello, good evening. Good evening. Hello? Okay. It's a very rickety mic. Bad mic.
Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. It's duct tape.
We can hear you.
George W. Bush would have been very happy with you. You might remember his campaign for all Americans to buy duct tape. Duct tape was the antidote against terrorism.
That cord came up.
Oh, well.
I don't want to go trip.
Don't trip on the cord.
Be careful of the cord.
Oh, he didn't say.
He almost said that. He did say you need to have bottled water and duct tape. He did say that. But he didn't say it's going to help you defeat Al-Qaeda. The only thing that helps you defeat Al-Qaeda is to keep bombing the world.
Yes,
You start in 2001, you go on forever.
yes.
And it continues today. I don't know if you looked and saw, but the
Yes.
Stockholm Institute released a new report about nuclear weapons. I don't know if you saw this. 3,000 warheads, I mean, the numbers are obscene. United States has, huge number of warheads and so on. You read that and it is no bearing on the news, if you know what I mean. Because the rest of the news cycle assumes that the United States is, a benevolent country. And the United States is so benevolent, it should be called upon to save the world. In other words, how does the United States save the world? By bombing other countries.
Yeah.
The most effective way to save the planet is to bomb it. That's the sort of logic of US benevolence, which, is not distant from our story, which is the story of the revolution in the Tsarist Empire. Because, the moment the workers and peasants created a liberated area, what did the United States do? What the United States always does. It invaded the Tsarist territories.
Yes, yes.
It's a habit of this country and has been for a very long time. It's a habit.
No,
Let's be clear.
it's its nature.
This is, I'm not going so far as you to say it's its nature, because after all, what is its nature? Its nature, shall we agree, is capitalism.
Yes,
If we agree that its nature is capitalism, in other words, that's the system that it has created, to trample upon the hopes and dreams of its people, if that's its nature, then I'll accept your term. Then certainly its habit is to bomb everybody, because we know that capitalism not only can't solve everyday questions of people, the everyday questions of people, but capitalism also generates warfare, whether it is, as the very young Marx and Engels wrote in the Communist Manifesto, whether it is to go and seek resources elsewhere, create markets elsewhere, or as Marx wrote later in the Grundrisse, whether it is to just generate waste. You see, Marx writes in the Grundrisse a very lovely little section where he says, a war is like throwing your treasure into the ocean. treasure is used, I think, in a double sense by Marx. In other words, when you throw your treasure into the ocean, somebody is making money. All wars generate money for somebody. But they also do destroy the productive capacity. When you have a crisis of accumulation, overcapacity and so on, war is a very useful instrument. So war is producing waste, not only seeking markets and so on. It's inherent in capitalism. It's let's say, its habit. Maybe we can say it's the double nature of capitalism. To generate massive production, but also to generate its destruction as war. That's the double nature of capital. It certainly does produce an immense multitude of commodities, unsurpassed, the amount of production capable. As Marx says, who knew that this slumbered in the lap of society, this immense productive capacity, but then its mirror image, this war, this waste. You have a workers' revolution, a peasants' revolution. What is the first thing they do? Send in the Marines. In Mexico, 6 years before that, the Mexican people overthrow, their leaders, Zapata, these names, emblazoned in the hearts of the Mexicans. Zapata, Emilio, what a great history Mexico has, its own history. Its history is not derived from the United States. It has its own history. It has its leaders. It has its Pancho Villa. Pancho Villa is not an imitation of George Washington. The United States has never had a Pancho Villa. In fact, the United States has never had a Zapata. In fact, never had these kind of mass peasant leaders who've been able to create. It's not a pale imitation of America. It has its own history. When they create the revolution, what do the Americans do? Once more, intervene on the side of reaction. Intervene on the side of reaction. In which moment of American history has America not intervened on the side of reaction? Let us begin again, 1789. When has America not intervened on the side of reaction? It is a familiar thing people say, America has been at war, and you see on the internet periodically those lists. This war, this war, this war, this war. But that's a bourgeois way of looking at this thing. It's not a question of which war have you been involved in. You've been involved in Vietnam, you've been involved in Korea. But it's not a question of which war. On whose side were you in those wars? That's the key question. That's when you become a socialist. That's when you understand imperialism. The question isn't, have you been at war? That's liberal anxiety about the warfare state. The question isn't, have you been at war? You understand, Joe? I mean, it's a common thing, right? Have you been at, well, we've been at war. Liberals will say, we're wasting money on war. The question isn't, are you wasting money on war? It's on whose side are you waging war, and on whose side are you wasting money? You're always wasting money on the side of reaction. You're always on the side of the reactionaries. So much so that you invade the first workers and peasant state, self-identified workers and peasant state. And then 70 years later, your own leftist intellectuals will deride that workers and peasant state. In other words, you will create in the United States a cottage industry from the left, from the so-called socialist left, of attacking the Soviet Union. It's from the United States that the rest of us read remarkable, fantastical accounts of how the Soviet Union is a state capitalist state, is a distorted state, is a decadent state. I used to read this stuff and marvel. What are you talking about? Have you no shame? You live inside a country that has always taken the side of reaction. And yet, when it comes to trying to analyze the worker and peasant state with all its problems, you take the hand of reaction in your analysis. You don't try to understand the dynamic of the Soviet Union. You take a position of hostility towards it. That used to strike me as amazing. It is the same attitude people held towards Cuba. You know, a generation and more of American leftists deriding the Cuban Revolution. Here is your country hell-bent on destroying this very small country and its quite brave and proud revolution. standing up against the United States. You know, its leadership representing the spirit of pride. You know, when they stood there and Castro spoke for a long time, people felt moved by the bravery of their leadership. It was not that these people were speaking on, you know, dominating. They were speaking with the voice of the people. The Cubans felt proud when Castro stood there and stood up to the United States. And yet, American leftists writing articles, books, non-stop, deriding Cuba, state capitalism. Do you remember this? Do you remember these traditions? This virulent attack on Cuba. Not from the right. You expect it from the right. You expect the right to take that position. You even expect it from the liberals. In fact, by the way, the liberals at some points were better than the left. You know, I don't know what you consider C. Wright Mills, but what was it called? Listen Up Yankee? What was that book? Listen Up Yankee?
Listen, Yankee.
Listen Yankee is a better book. I don't know how you categorize Mills. Was he a left liberal or I don't know what, doesn't matter really. But the sectarian American left was so terrible on Cuba because they would say, you know, state capitalism. You remember this stuff. They would almost get to the point, I'm sure, of supporting an American invasion of Cuba. I'm sure. I don't know. I'm just manufacturing this last bit. I'm not sure. But I can imagine them. As today, so many of these leftists support US imperialism. So many of them, you know, casually. Yes, it's a good idea, let's bomb Syria. It's a good idea, let's bomb Libya. You know, on behalf of the people. Have you lost your mind? Because your government always wages war on the side of reaction. You cannot say that this war is being waged on the side of the people. This war, how? How did it change its colors when the class character of the state is unchanged? The class character of the state that waged war brutally against the Vietnamese people. Brutally against the Vietnamese people. The class character of that state is identical to the class character of this state, maybe some modifications. Small modifications. How can you say that when the Americans under Obama bombed Libya, they bombed Libya to help the people, when you know that they didn't want to help the Vietnamese? You know that. I mean, how many people will stand up and say, the American government did a good thing in Vietnam. United States government should have pursued that war until they destroyed the Vietnamese, because after all, we're so disappointed by the Vietnamese communists. Have you heard this?
Yeah.
I'm disappointed. They've sold out. They've gone to they've restored capitalism, neoliberalism. Have you heard this? Do our people say this kind of thing? I'm disappointed. Hey, who are you to be disappointed in anything? What have you made in your society? Have you been able to overthrow and change the class configuration in this country? Have you made a revolution? Have you changed this reactionary character of the state? No. But you will, again, from the lofty heights of the American left, having condemned the USSR, then having condemned Cuba, you will condemn the Vietnamese, then you will condemn this, you will condemn that. That becomes your habit. You become a handmaiden, as it were, of imperialism. You say, we are not imperialists. We just believe that in this case, by some homeopathic means, the United States government is going to do good for the people. It is in this case, small case, this particular case is doing a good job. Incredible. I mean, you know, Chomsky, for instance, will go on Democracy Now! And he'll say that the United States is the most destructive force on the planet. Correct?
Yeah.
Noam has been saying that. I mean, you know, this is his constant thing. The United States is the most destructive force on the planet. You'll hear him saying that on Monday on Democracy Now! Then on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, you'll hear people coming there and saying, I think it's a good idea to support US bombing in Syria. How is this possible? Have you lost your mind? It's a reactionary government. It invaded the USSR right after the fall of the Tsarist Empire. I'm going to come back to that, don't worry. I'm going around in a circle to make a specific point. After 1975, when the Americans were defeated in Vietnam, what did they leave behind? Has anybody looked into this? What did the Americans leave behind? They destroyed that country.
Yeah.
Agent Orange.
Yes.
They
And I-
destroyed the soil.
Yes, I just got back from there.
What did you find?
Agent Orange, dioxin, and terrible, terrible deformities of the children who, fourth generation of Agent Orange being passed out.
Fourth generation
Yes.
children being born with deformities.
Yes, and unexploded ordinances throughout the country.
And agriculture was destroyed.
Yeah.
Because you chemically destroyed agriculture in Vietnam.
Yes.
The country was without means. And then there is a war against China. You may remember this. Some of you may remember in 1978. You don't remember. China invaded Vietnam. The Vietnamese then went and overthrew the Khmer Rouge, which was backed by the Americans. The bloody genocidal Khmer Rouge, backed by the Americans. The Vietnamese went and overthrew them. And then Hun Sen comes and so on. That's another story. But what is the fact of it? The fact of it is, having destroyed Vietnam, they still were committed to making a socialist revolution, but they had to make the socialist revolution in terrible constraints. And that's what I want to talk about in the beginning today, before I move to the third world. You know, many of you have read Marx, Lenin, and so on, the great writers. I hope so. You know, it's not too much to ask that you've read a little Marx. At least once a year you should read Capital.
Right.
Do they hold study groups at the James Connolly Forum? Capital study group?
Not yet.
You must have a study group. I mean, the thing about reading Capital is that it really is gives you a shield against bourgeois ideology. You know, you require the shield to be constant. You take your car in to be seen by the mechanic every so many thousands of miles. But you don't need to take your brain in to be seen by Santo Carlos. Because as Che called him, Santa Carlos, you know, is very helpful to immunization against bourgeois ideology. We read our Marx, we read our Lenin, and so on. And one of the things we learn is Marx says in much of his prose, he's very conscious of this because he's a historical materialist. He says that revolutions must happen in the realm of freedom. They cannot happen in the realm of necessity. In other words, poor countries will have a hard time socializing wealth and finding the way to get resources to develop their economies. That you need to have, if a breakthrough must happen, it must come in Germany, for instance, or Britain. These are the core countries in the capitalist system. These must lead the way into socialism. It is something, for instance, Kautsky and others took as a religion. And they were stunned when the Russians made a revolution. But this idea of the realm of freedom and realm of necessity are very important for us. And I'm going to spend a little time, as I said, on them. What happened was the revolutions didn't happen in the realm of freedom. You know, right after the Russian Revolution or the revolution against the Tsarist Empire, Lenin kept looking to Germany. Where is this revolution? You know, you are all familiar very much, I'm sure, with Luxembourg and Leibniz and the Spartacus Bund section of the what becomes the German Communist Party, and their attempt at the uprising. Of course, the killing of Leibniz and Luxembourg and the throwing into a canal by the government of the Social Democrat Ebert, not the conservatives, not the Nazis. The people who killed Luxembourg and Leibniz were Social Democrats, were the government of Friedrich Ebert. You know, some years ago I was invited to a forum which was jointly sponsored by the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, so Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, and the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. And I had to write to them and say, I can't come to a forum which is sponsored by the killer and the killed. It seems rather odd that you're collaborating. You should change your name. I mean, Ebert's government killed Luxembourg. How can you hold a forum together? It's bizarre. It goes against Luxembourg's heritage, it seems to me. Nonetheless, the revolutions didn't happen. All the revolutions of the 20th century, my friends, happened in the realm of necessity. Look at it. Tsarist Empire, 1917. 1918, Mongolia. Then let's move forward. Let's talk about only socialist revolutions, not the others. Not Iran, 1911. Not Mexico, 1911. Let's just stay with these. We start with the USSR, the Tsarist Empire. We move to Mongolia. Then let's skip ahead. 1949, China, People's Republic of China. Then let's skip even further. 1959, Cuba. Then let's jump ahead to Vietnam, 75. Which of these countries was in the realm of freedom? None. Which of these countries was not a peasant society? Proletariat, minuscule proletariat. All countries devastated by war. The Tsarist Empire already destroyed by World War I, and then the White Armies invade. Mongolia, destroyed, devastated by war. China, racked by war. I highly recommend Jack Belden's book, a book that needs to be read and is long forgotten. You might not know Jack Belden. He was a very brave American journalist. He was sort of Jack Reed, but of the Chinese Revolution. The book is called China Shakes the World. You know, it's an extraordinary book. It's as good, maybe better than 10 Days That Shook the World. And the reason is, as Owen Lattimore wrote in the preface to that book, that Jack Belden knew in China where the lice lay. You know, it's a good line, where the lice lay. He knew the homes of the working class, the sex workers, the dock workers. So this is a book of the Chinese Revolution from the standpoint of the most wretched sections of the working class. You know, not the leadership. It's not about Mao. It's not like Edgar Snow's book, Red Star over China. You know, Edgar Snow was mainly with the leadership in Yemen. It's not like Agnes Smedley's book, which is on Tudor, because Tudor was a general and Agnes got his story. This is the story of people who had in their homes one pair of pants. And he writes in one section that the man went out and the woman had to lie in bed because he took the pants. Literally, he wore the pants in the family. And then he came home and he gave her the pants and she went out. They had one pair of pants. This is the level of poverty in northern China where Jack Belden was traveling. They made a revolution. But this is a peasant society. This is not a society in the realm of freedom. Cuba, friends, Cuba, those of you like John who have traveled to Cuba, you know that it's a peasant society. Even now, it's rooted in rural Cuba. You know, that's the epicenter of the society. Maybe in Havana it's something, you know, lovely culture. But the epicenter of the society is not in the city, it's in the countryside. Most definitely Vietnam, peasant society, that was a peasant army that defeated the United States Army. So in the realm of necessity, these revolutions are made. And as historical materialists, we know that it's going to be very difficult to marshal the kind of resources needed to maintain the revolution. And this is what impressed countries around the world, especially in the third world, after the Tsarist Empire had collapsed. In 1927, on the 10th anniversary of the new USSR, the new state, India's nationalist leader, Jawaharlal Nehru, no left-wing person, by the way, he was neither a communist nor really even a socialist. At most, he was what could be called a Fabian. At most, a sort of left-wing liberal, like Bertrand Russell, for instance, that kind of politics. Very much a left liberal perspective. Nehru goes to the Soviet Union in 1927, and when he comes back, he writes a book called Soviet Russia. This is a very instructive book. It's a very important book for those of us trying to understand the impact of the USSR on the third world. Because what Nehru says is, this society is like our society. You know, to compare India to England is impossible. Because England has sucked dry India of its resources to build its modernity. In other words, you know, a friend of mine 30 years ago now applied to Yale University. And in the application letter he said, I'm from Chennai, from Madras, and I'm applying to Yale University, and I think you should give me a full scholarship. And the reason I think you should give me a full scholarship is the person who funded Yale University is Sir Elihu Yale, who was governor of Madras and stole all our wealth and deposited it in New Haven, Connecticut. A pretty good reason to be applied. Of course, he didn't get it. But that's a narrow-mindedness of, you know, these institutions. They want you to forget how they made their money. Yale University's monies come from India. It doesn't come from, you know, whatever. And half these so-called rich people, rich families, Astor's, you know, Astor Place in New York, drugs. They were drug people. They made money in the opium trade. Forbes magazine, drugs, just drugs. If you understood England or English banks and so on, Barings Bank, all drugs, just opium trade. These are wretched histories. They don't want you to remember them. You see, they don't want you to remember them. So Nehru says, we can't look to England to understand how to break out of this cycles of wretchedness in India, backwardness. You know, nowadays it's no longer seen as a good thing to talk about backwardness. I can't say backwardness. You know, I've always found this linguistic politics to be garbage. You know, you tell me how to describe the country I come from, where 1 in 2 people doesn't know whether they'll eat today. Okay, 700 million people go to sleep hungry every night. Now you give me the correct vocabulary. You know, what vocabulary should I use that it doesn't upset you? I prefer the vocabulary backwardness. We will only no longer be backward when people are not hungry at this rate. United States is a backward society. With so much wealth, you have incredible hunger. That poor people's campaign, it's going to raise the issues again of endemic hunger in this country. Hunger, not anything short of hunger, maybe even starvation. This is backwardness. You are only a society when your people are fed, when they are able to read, when they have some time for leisure, when they have some time to build community. Otherwise, you are a backward society. Nehru said, we can't look to England for a model. Then he comes to the Soviet Union and he says, this is amazing. He says, he says, seek evidence of their advances, not in the power plant, not in the roads, not in any of that. That's superficial. This is a very insightful observation. He says, I see the advance in the society. That everywhere I go, everywhere I travel, he said, even though I have, you know, people who take us places, we know that this is genuine, he writes. What do I see? I see in small towns, women's associations. I see youth associations. I see theater groups. I see cultural life. I see the churning of society. I see people in literacy campaigns, very important, Lickbez, the literacy campaign that the Soviet Union produced in the first 10 years. I see literacy campaigns. He said, in our country, when the British left, by the way, India in 1947, can anybody tell me what was the literacy rate in India? 1947, British had been there for 350 years. 350 years, they stole the wealth of India to build this third-rate island, which I don't know how it was able to colonize most of the world. It's a pathetic little place. Fortunately now it's being taken over by Indians.
Yes.
And by people from the Caribbean.
Yes.
And that's why all this Brexit nonsense is happening. This is all a short-term thing. They can have their Brexit. Soon, it will truly be our country. So I don't know what they're getting worked up about. As it is, the leading foods there are from India, and you know.
Right.
I mean, it's ridiculous that they don't surrender immediately to us. Forget the Chinese. I mean, the Indians have taken over. So, Nehru says, look at the literacy campaign, because he's aware that when the British eventually leave 20 years after this book is published, the literacy rate in India was 12%. 350 years they were in India with the so-called mission of civilizing us. And they didn't teach us how to read. Before the British arrived, our literacy rate was higher. It's amazing. You know, people don't pay attention to these basic facts. Nehru is in Soviet Union, 27. He already sees literacy rate is rising very fast. Now, he says they're government statistics. I'm not interested in that, he says. Don't show me those statistics. I don't have faith in them. Whatever. He's a liberal man. Soviets, he says, are cooking the books. Let them cook the books. But when I go to these small towns and villages, I see these associations. I see people meeting and conversing and talking. There's a churning in society. And there's a churning in peasant society. It's a very key thing. It's not that the salons in the city are filled with people discussing things. No, that's not interesting, because that's going to happen anyway, correct? Look at us. In the great city of Troy, in the James Connolly Forum, these salons happen anyway. Unless you are willing to come with me and we agree this is a rural area. Which, it's not, it's a good question to, I can see that.
Between type
It's
of
peri-urban. There are terms they've come out, rural-urban, peri-urban.
That's very Indian.
Peri-urban. But this is in the middle of rural areas, he says. There's a churning going on. That's what impressed people in a peasant society. Fine, they are building with the first 5-year plan, second 5. but the churning, that's what impressed them. And how were they impressed? Well, luckily, and I say luckily advisedly, luckily for the Soviet leadership, luckily, they were in a multi-ethnic empire. Luckily for them. Which meant that they had to, as socialists, confront the colonial question. Not regarding India, but regarding their own empire. Which is why national self-determination for all nationalities. Self-determination for all nationalities. That was the slogan. It was about the Uzbeks and others, right? But you can imagine, you're sitting now in Egypt, you're sitting in Korea, you're sitting in all these places under the yoke of colonialism, and you're listening to these crazy people. Remember what Trotsky looked like? You remember the crazy hair, little bit, you know, crazy hair, little glasses,
Yes.
you know, Lenin. Imagine the feeling this must have evoked when people saw and heard and read the statements they were making, fulminating against colonialism, using the language of national liberation, talking about John Bull imperialism and this imperialism and that imperialism. Imagine that. They'd overthrown an empire and they were anti-imperialists. Imagine that. We're talking now the 1910s. In 1919, in the town of Amritsar, right when communist ideas start entering India in 1919, you know, the British go into a square public meeting, men, women and children are there, and they bring in armored vehicles and just kill hundreds of people in Jallianwala Bagh. Small park, tiny, you can go and visit it. It's near the Golden Temple in Amritsar, just down the street. Massacres aplenty. 1919. In 1911, the Italians had pioneered aerial bombardment in Libya. You know, this is why the West had to bomb again in 2011. It's the 100th anniversary. The first aerial bombardment was 1911, when the Italians bombed, and then they came back 100 years later, because you can't let an anniversary go uncelebrated.
Right, right.
You might as well bomb the same country.
Right.
You know, why bomb elsewhere? They had bombed. Ruthless violence against colonized people. That was the experience, by the way, of these countries with Europeans. It's got to be clear about that. The direct, tangible experience was with brute violence. Suddenly there are these European-looking people, you know, face it, okay? You know, Trotsky and others. These were not, you know, Lenin, even Stalin, you know, Stalin had the biggest peasant hands in the early leadership. You know, you got to remember one thing. You'll sneer at all this, but all those people who become the head of the Soviet Union, they all came from very different backgrounds than your Coolidges and Hoovers and, you know, Roosevelts and what are they, bankers and so, rich families and
Right.
industrial, what are they? You know, I mean, what are they? What is this man? Real estate, charlatan, I don't know.
Robber baron.
You know, robber baron. I mean, you know, look at the history of your leadership, okay? This leadership which is always on the side of reaction. Where do they come from? What is their class background? Meanwhile, you know, you had Khrushchev, you know, Khrushchev. I mean, look at his body. Look at his body language. This was the son of a peasant.
Right.
You know, when he takes his shoe off and bangs it in the United Nations,
Right.
he's the son of a peasant, you know. You know why they hate Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela? He was a bus driver. He was a bus driver, and how dare he speak like that? And by the way, in the Venezuelan press, that's how they write about him. Bus driver, monkey. They use the term monkey in the press about. Don't underestimate what happens when ordinary people have an agenda on behalf of ordinary people and come to power. They're derided. The jokes about Khrushchev, you know, uncouth. Really? Uncouth for whom? You know, the question is perspective, right? No, when you look at him from the third world, you say, wow, Khrushchev took his shoe off and banged it on the table. Admirable. Here, uncouth. India, admirable. Ghana, wow, admirable. Standing up to the West, takes his shoe off, bangs it on the table. Stalin, peasant. Koba was a peasant. I'm not talking about the gulags. You can talk about all that if you want, but that's boring because we all know about all that. And it's execrable and whatever. That's fine. Okay, we can make a righteous judgment. I'm just talking about Koba, this big peasant guy, like a giant, standing there with that hat on during World War II, going to defeat the People's War. People are like, wow, this bloody peasant is standing there, banging tables, sitting down with Roosevelt, banker's son, in Yalta. What the hell is going on in the world? That's what I want you to understand, because if you want to understand the Red Star over the Third World, that influence, you got to understand that this was the realm of necessity. It was a peasant society. They actually committed themselves to improving the people's consciousness and livelihood. It wasn't just a livelihood revolution. This is a very wrong interpretation of the USSR. It wasn't just a livelihood. People say, well, they gave them housing, they gave them this. It was supposed to also be a conscious, because literacy was such an important part of it. Go back and see how they said that in Uzbekistan you can read and write in your own language. It's a nationalities policy. It's incredible. Today in Turkey you can't, well, today you can, but for many you couldn't even read in Kurdish. And it was a NATO ally. But in Soviet Union, your languages were promoted. Now, there are of course problems, huge problems, resettling populations, forget all that. Not forget it, keep it in mind, but that's not the point I'm getting at. And then you had, from literacy, you had these monstrous characters coming from rural areas to sit in the chairs of the powerful. How dare they? Very appealing in the other side of the world. Because of that national, 5-10 minutes more, then we can talk. Is that okay? Okay, I can go forever on this stuff. Yeah. Tell me when you're getting bored and want to ask a question. Yeah.
What in the bourgeois? I know Nehru was very upper class. I mean, how did the upper class in India specifically, and the rest of the world, the upper class, see these peasants get up and do things? I mean, didn't that strike them with fear?
See, the interesting thing is, let's take the Indian case.
Yeah.
It's an interesting, instructive case. You're right. Nehru's father was an important lawyer. He was a bourgeois politician, Motilal Nehru. His son went and studied law in Cambridge and so on. But I think they understood by the 1920s, they understood very well that you couldn't have a constitutionalist movement to overthrow imperialism. In other words, it was not enough to circulate a petition to end imperialism. That's what the early Congress Party used to do. What's the point of circulating a petition? Nobody takes you seriously. Hello, American politics today. How many petitions have you signed today? Has it changed anything?
No.
You gotta build power on the streets. They understood that. They understood that.
How did they understand that though?
Because the other thing wasn't working.
So,
And once again, just to finish this, and then Gandhi, this is the one thing Gandhi does, you got to give it to Gandhi. Gandhi taught the elite politicians the utility of mass struggle. Mass struggles have been happening in India forever. But Gandhi instructed them about its power and he tried to control them. That was the compromise with the bourgeoisie. We have to have mass struggles, but we should try to control them. That was Gandhi's ingenious thing, through self-discipline and all these mystical things that he promoted. But he put mass struggle on the table. It was not to go away after that, so that then India, it became inevitable India would be a democracy. You have to engage the masses. That was the core thing. And so then Nehru goes to Russia and says the masses are engaged not only politically but culturally and socially. That's the most difficult part. Sorry. Yeah.
I was wondering, is there a separation that we can make between anti-imperialist struggle versus more or less socialist struggle, for lack of better terminology?
Yes.
Meaning people will make compromises and work with people of much lower classes and go for a common goal, common cause, but then the vision for the society that follows once you overthrow the imperialist power, that's when people will separate again.
So this is a very important distinction, or perhaps very important space of discussion, not a distinction, but place of discussion. See, one interesting feature is that when the Tsarist Empire collapsed, that is to say in February, and then in October when the Bolsheviks engineered the seizure of power, when the revolution took place, And when the white armies start to come back, the white armies have a difficult time coming back. Okay, if October had never happened, the land to the people. You see, the Kerensky government would have immediately collaborated as they had started to do. You see, what happens is, there is the revolution in February, and that to some extent is a European revolution. It takes place in the European sector of the Tsarist Empire. When the revolution takes place in February and Kerensky's government comes, Kerensky says, we won't stop the war. Remember, he says we'll continue the war. And secondly, he doesn't commit himself to the slogan of land, bread, and peace. The key slogan of the Bolsheviks. You see, what Lenin and the Bolsheviks figured out, and by the way, Lenin plays such a heroic role here. You know, I don't care what people say, you know, don't talk about great leader, small leader, whatever. Figure it out, guys. Go read the April thesis. You know, in the letter from afar, April, I mean, he bangs on that it's very important to maintain the worker-peasant alliance. Don't forget, this is not just a workers' uprising. So worker-peasant, why? Between February and October, the revolution actually becomes Tsarist Empire-wide. It's happening in Central Asia. It's happening in Dagestan, in Chechnya, in Armenia, you know, all the zones of the colonized people, let's say. And for in these areas, the land question is fundamental. So the Bolsheviks say, we are going to honor the slogan, land, peace, and bread. Okay? This means no war, out of the imperialist war. This means we are going to redistribute land. And we are going to deal with hunger. Three key issues of the people. It's very important. They're at the pulse of the people here. When those aristocrats returned in the white armies, you see, aristocrat on a horse can't fight by themselves. They need peasants on the ground for them to tell them, charge. So what does the aristocrat do? Aristocrat gets on the horse, beautiful hat with a plume. They take out their cutlass and they say, charge! But they are holding the horse back. They are telling you, musics, you know, peasants, you go and die like cannon fodder. Huh?
Fight for me.
Fight for me.
Yeah.
When they return, backed by the Americans and British and others, Japanese, you know, when they come back to the Tsar, the peasants say, why should we come with you? See, they have told us that in this new USSR, the land is ours. You are telling us, come and fight so we can restore our land. You see what I mean? Here, anti-imperialism and socialism fused. In this moment of the Russian Revolution, it fuses. There is no gap. Because their anti-imperialist position had to be a socialist. But I would argue that you can't have an anti-imperialism that's not socialist. Anti-imperialism has to have a socialist component. Otherwise, you're merely a moralizer. You're moralizing about anti-war, this, that. How can you be anti-war if you're not a socialist? You know, then you'll start talking about, I'm against war, but I don't have anything to offer the people. You see, people will turn around to you and you're against war. What about my jobs making bombs? What about my jobs making guns and so on? What do you offer the people as an alternative to that? You have to have a socialist program that says that we can create an economy that rips out the war from inside it, that produces a different kind of economy. You have to be able to reach people's imagination like that. It's not enough to say we are against war. What's the point of being against war? If you are for peace, what does that mean? That doesn't mean you surrender to power. It means you want to transcend the system. Right? So in that sense, the revolution of 1917, particularly October, puts the thing into unity. And which is why, of course, the liberals were not going to go for it. Because this had to be a socialist revolution. You know, it's really worth reading Lenin's writings. Lenin is not a writer. Lenin is not an individual. Lenin was very much able to channel the views of people around him. You know, he was a very keen communist writer. In other words, he didn't think I'm a genius. He went to meeting after meeting, listened to people and summarized the left-wing thought in that meeting as the thought of the whole meeting. Very clever, that Lenin. Very canny. But he listened to people, listened to arguments, produced counter-arguments. It's not just the individual. The Bolsheviks at the time were thinking in that direction. You cannot have a... So in that sense, the gap is zero, right? So I would make a very strong case that to be an anti-imperialist but not a socialist is a contradiction in terms. How is it possible? I would like somebody to explain. Libertarian anti-war, that fellow cries on his TV channel. I can't understand what his politics are. I've forgotten his name. That guy who cries on his channel.
Rand Paul.
Not Rand Paul. Not Glenn Beck. That fellow who's anti-war but libertarian.
Alex Jones.
Alex Jones.
Oh,
He's crazy.
I mean, I don't understand that politics of that guy. It seems
he
incoherent to
doesn't
me.
have a politics.
He's crazy.
He's got supplements and horse shit. I mean, that's
Whatever it is, he's supposed to be anti-war, but he's the libertarian. I don't understand it, frankly. I don't even try to understand. Some sort of bizarre crying therapy television show.
crisis actor.
He cries a lot on it, which is a nice thing to see a man crying. It's not a bad thing. If that's all he does, he provides a role model for white men to cry on TV, that's enough for me. Maybe that's what his role is actually. We should understand his role like that. But certainly I don't get the politics of it. So I think it's incoherent, frankly. Maybe that's why he's crying. The incoherence is making him sad. God knows. God knows. But look again from the standpoint of the third world. This is the last point I want to make. Look again from that standpoint. What did the Soviet Union do? Right after this very beleaguered revolution takes place, they set up schools to train revolutionaries from the third world. The College of the Toilers of the East, the Stalin School, etc. Thousands of people came from, South Africa, from Latin America, from the Arab world, from Europe, from Asia, thousands of people. Ho Chi Minh comes to the Stalin School, becomes a teacher there, in fact. Tan Malaka, these very important figures later in their own countries, come and they train inside the Soviet Union. What are they cutting their teeth on? They're actually cutting their teeth on talking to each other. It's a part of it that people leave out. I learned most in university from my fellow students, much more than from my teachers. I found my teachers to be quite boring. Fellow students, very interesting, because we were all seized of the same things we wanted to argue about. Imagine the Stalin School, Ho Chi Minh, Malacca, these other, they're all yelling and arguing with each other. Amazing. We don't have a transcript of that, sadly. We don't understand what they were, but we have some few fleeting glimpses of what was happening there. But they trained thousands of people. They helped them go back to their countries. Yes, sure, they sent Comintern agents. This is also a big fantasy, by the way. Some of it in this generation festered by Yale University Press and its series on communism that they published, where they took the most sensational parts of the Soviet archive and published them. Where there's like, Michael Borodin in China and the intrigues. I mean, give me a break. I've been in the communist movement long enough to know that when these foreign agents arrive, most people look at them with a real gimlet eye, like, really, you're going to help us? I mean, you're going to, it's very much exaggerated, the role that they play. But of course, what's not exaggerated is that they did provide institutional support, and that's helpful. Margaret Stevens has a very nice new book out from Pluto Press, which is, I've forgotten the name, but it's basically about the United States and the Caribbean and the role of the Comintern. And it talks about how the Red Trade Union movement helped the creation of Red Oriente in Cuba. There was an uprising in 1934 in eastern Cuba. And the role played by the Red Trade Union movement, they played a very important. C.L.R. James, and I quote James in this book, writes about your friend C.L.R. James, writes in the book that, I quoted him where he says that, all these trade unionists from Lagos to Colombo to wherever would read this Red Trade Union newsletter. And that newsletter helped shape their internationalism. You can imagine that you're a docker in Colombo, Sri Lanka, then Ceylon, and you're reading about some struggle in Kingston, Jamaica. Imagine the consciousness that is created. Imagine, by the way, that you are a docker in Colombo, Sri Lanka, Ceylon, and you are a part of the trade union movement, and as a part of your movement, you're sent to the USSR as a delegate. Imagine what this meant for a worker to go to the USSR, to spend a week, 10 days. You know, what this did, you know, some people said it was red tourism. I think that's a stupid statement, red tourism. It opened people to the world. You know, they went to international youth festivals, they went to trade union congresses, they met people from elsewhere. We exaggerate Soviet authority, but we underestimate the institutional connections that the Soviet Union enabled. We exaggerate its authority. Didn't have that much authority over movements, but we underestimate the connections it was able to foster. And that's part of what I'm very keen to emphasize in the book I've written. It's a very short book. But what I really wanted to emphasize was what it meant, what the USSR meant to these countries. I wanted to emphasize what it enabled, you know, what it enabled. And I also wanted to emphasize how the communist movements in these countries criticized and fought with the USSR and were yet part of this very complicated, you know, relationship. I belong to a political party, the Communist Party of India, Marxist. My party, the Communist Party of India, which was founded in 1920 in Tashkent, Soviet Union. Our party was founded in Tashkent, not in India proper. It was Muhajirs or exiles who had fled India, went through Afghanistan at great peril, arrived in the young USSR. Some of them were trying to go to Turkey because many of them were pan-Islamists and were interested in joining the Khilafat movement to protect the caliphate in Turkey. But they were not able to turn left, so they went north and wound up in Tashkent and became communists. You know, many of them started as pan-Islamists in the journey, became communists. And in 1920, they found the Communist Party of India. This party, from 1951 to 1964, had a long inner party struggle around the question of how to understand the USSR and how to understand the Indian bourgeoisie. And in 1964, we eventually split. My section, the larger party, the very much bigger party, CPIM, Communist Party of India Marxist, decided that the Soviet Union was part of our movement, but was not the guide of our movement. We had to develop our own analysis of Indian conditions, and we had to be able to derive our own strategy. We shouldn't be reliant on the USSR. But the second thing is, our party decided that the Indian bourgeoisie was collaborating with imperialism. It didn't have enough national sentiment to overcome its class position. See, whatever residue was there from the freedom movement had been exhausted by 1964. So the bourgeoisie was class collaborationist with imperialism. And from 64 we charted an independent path, but yet developed eventually independent relations with the USSR. When the USSR started to fall apart in the 80s, in our party, there was not gloating that the USSR was falling apart. I mean, we felt that the world was going to be lessened by its demise. Even though we disagreed with so many things that the USSR was doing, we felt it would be less, and it would be lessened on exactly these scores. That here we would see revanchist, worst kind of, you know, kind of molten, toxic form of imperialism would return if the USSR collapsed. And indeed, that's what happened. The war in Iraq was the prelude to this. Before that, maybe the war in Panama in '89. A toxic kind of imperialism would return, an imperialism with no constraints. And that's exactly what happened. And we felt that those networks that the USSR had facilitated would disappear. That would be a loss for us. You know, we wouldn't have some of the frameworks, institutional frameworks for internationalism. It's exactly what we are now facing. Which is why some of my current work with the, you know, Tricontinental, and I can tell you later about this, and the schools project and the international assemblies and etc., etc., etc. So much of the things I'm involved in currently is how do we bring back the institutional forms of internationalism, not in consciousness. You know, it's not enough to feel international. We need international institutions that link our movements together, not individuals, but movements together. You know, that's what the Soviet Union provided for the Third World. That institutional rigging that held together that politics. However much you disagreed with them, you agreed with the need for that rigging, those lines in a ship that hold things together. That was essential. And the loss of that has been quite catastrophic. Our left movement today is certainly in deep crisis. The crisis is, of course, as I just said, institutional, but it's also ideological crisis. There's amazing level of adoption of bourgeois narratives of reality. It's incredible. I mean, the things one hears from left is incredible. I had started by talking about people's interpretation of the Libya war. Incredible. I mean, they think the United States is a benevolent power. It's incredible. People now, left liberals in the United States, even some leftists are against the issue of the Korean Peninsula. Why? The Korean people don't want to be hostage to nuclear threats any longer. You should support the Korean people. That's our principal, place of origin. Just because it's Trump, who cares it's Trump? This is not led by Trump. This particular deal was led by the Korean people. Trump was an irrelevant sideshow. Much more important role behind the scenes by China. Anyway, it's a sideshow. People have strange ideas. They're not grounded in an analysis of the world situation as it is. One of the things we benefited from the Soviet Union is every once in a while they would release their analysis of world situation. The CPSU would release it. Now, even when I didn't agree with it, while arguing against it, we would form a worldview. Today people are not having those kind of discussions. What is your view of the world? Comrade, what is your view of the world? They're not having those discussions. They have some, buffet-like attitude towards world affairs. I am going to buffet Syria, or I'm going to buffet Iran, or buffet Venezuela, or buffet Ecuador. I mean, what is your sense of the world? What is your understanding of the balance of forces? What is your class perspective? None of that seems on the table, friends. I don't get it at any rate. I just see this buffet attitude toward things. And if you try to suggest that you need an overarching framework, at least to have a discussion with, you get accused of all kinds of bizarre things, which I don't understand half the things people accuse you of. I'm asking you, give me a broad understanding of world affairs. That's how our movement proceeds. In a discussion, we always say, what is the general situation of the world today? On the basis of that, what is the situation in our country? On the basis of that, what should our program be? You need to develop a political program based on a democratic and shared understanding of the world. Otherwise, it's an authoritarian program. How did you derive a program without a shared understanding of the world? That's how we proceed in our political life. Is you first have a debate about how do you understand the world, and then you produce a program of struggle. Now they want to reverse it. Produce the program of struggle first, and then discuss everything else. Like produce a program of struggle, which means overthrow all dictators in the planet, except the United States government. It's amazing. You want to go and save Syria, you want to save Libya, but you don't want to save the United States. You're content to use the United States government to overthrow other dictators. Your own dictatorship of capital here can sit back and say we have elections. So you are a left-wing person deluded by, this manufactured consent of elections.
Right.
Strange to me. When we look back at the history of the USSR, last point, we should remember that it only lasted for 7 decades. USSR only lasted roughly 7 decades, 6 or some decades, not long, 70 odd years. In the early pages of Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution, he writes something very interesting. He writes that capitalism has taken hundreds of years to develop. Hundreds of years, and it still pleads youth. Hundreds of years, it still pleads youth. He says, our Bolshevik revolution is only about 10 years old, and they keep condemning us to failure.
Oh.
Why don't you give us a few hundred years?
Yes, yes.
It only lasted 70 years. It was quite an amazing experiment. It collapsed. As I was saying earlier, every revolution has the right to fail. Don't condemn it because it failed. Don't remember 1917 by 1991. Remember 1917 for what it was. When the workers and peasants of the Tsarist Empire tore through time and took over their government, their society, tried to make something different. I hope we teach our friends and our children and others this story. Because if they don't remember it like this, they won't feel that they can tear through time. And unless we tear through time, it's the end of our civilization. Thanks so much. Yeah, about 20 odd minutes, and then I can tell you a little about the books I brought later, because I'm also a shopkeeper. So,
You got plenty of time.
yeah. Plenty of time, let's go. Okay, I just didn't see the clock there. Please.
Well, I'm always interested in how to bring more wisdom into the decision-making process that affects people. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, anybody's thoughts, certainly your thoughts, but thoughts on how to do that. During your talk, of course, you're going to speak of classes, and I expect that. And I know there's a correlation between attitudes and classes, but it's not 100%, and it's not ironclad. And it's really, as far as we can tell, who knows what metaphysics really is, but we enter the world like as if it's a throw of the dice. Individuals cannot choose who their parents are, at least in general metaphysical or plain, point of view. So given that's true, and given that anybody can vary in their moral compass and their caring and their wisdom about how to maximize goodness, truth, beauty, etc., I'd be interested in your ideas about how do we get that going? Because what I see now is basically sociopaths rule, and the system is set up to make it easy for intelligent sociopaths to grab oppressive power. So how do we undo that?
No, it's a very important and good question, particularly now. I mean, because the sociopaths are ruling globally. One of the books I brought is called Strong Men. And it has an essay by Eve Ensler on Trump. It's a hilarious essay. I called her and said, I want you to write on Trump. She immediately agreed. And the others are, one is an actor, one is a writer, novelist, Burhan Sonmez on Erdogan. They are interesting, thoughtful people because they are artists, sensitive people. So they take on these, malignancies are quite interesting. They are not doing frontal combat on their ideas. They get under their skin, They want to understand why their moral compass is so narrow. It's an important exercise. I think it's quite successful. I mean, one thing that I've been thinking about a lot is that people around the world are deeply demoralized. Capitalism has certainly gone into the phase where production of what the ILO calls decent work is not going to happen. The International Labour Organization has this concept of decent work. It also uses this concept of the precariat, the precarious proletariat. Increasingly, not only younger people but also older people are finding themselves shunted into the rail of precarious employment, adjuncting, part-time, flexible. As if flexible is an appealing term, huh?
Literally.
Whatever.
Amazon Flex is a labor
Amazon
thing.
Flex. God knows what these things are. They
Everyone's
come
a
up with.
contract worker and no one has a guarantee
Exactly.
of being able to eat.
I mean, it's disgusting. This is our civilization, though. And increasingly, this is what's happening to employment. People are facing this. In India, for instance, so many agricultural workers, women, travel miles every day, 2 hours of thing, to come to a railhead to see if they'll be employed that day. If they don't, they have to walk all the way back. I mean, it's brutal and inhumane. And then in India, you may not know, but 400,000 farmers have committed suicide in 15 years.
400?
400, maybe 500,000. More than people killed in Syria. But, this is irrelevant. Because after all, there's a difference between a war and this kind of silent war against agriculturalists, against agricultural workers. It's a concerted attack by the Monsantos and the Cargills and these other big companies. It's a war that they are waging against agriculture. So the demoralization is economic. I mean, if you're a young person and you look at this economy, you wonder, what the hell? What is this? I'm going to now be basically submerged under debt, no job, no dignity. What the hell? Then social life is under attack. Forms of sociality, everything is commodified. Where can you go where it's reasonably priced or whatever? You know, you go to a bar, it's expensive. So social life is commodified. You know, the culture of just hanging out in somebody's house, you know, that will have to return. Come sit in my living room. You know, let's drink some cheap liquor in the living room. I don't know how people are going to socialize given this demoralization. Politically, immense demoralization. You know, who is carrying your burden? Which political party is carrying your burden? You see, Trump will come there and say all kinds of things. And that's actually moving to people because he says, nobody cares about you. That's true. Your jobs are being stolen. That's true. See, he said everything that was interesting. But of course, then he takes the first exit on the highway of ideology. He says, your jobs are going, blame the Mexicans. Why do you say blame the Mexicans? Go to the next exit. Blame capitalism, blame the way in which the system is morphed into this attack on livelihood and dignity. I'm interested in dignity because I'm talking about demoralization. You can't live a dignified life today. That's what people respond to. But of course, because the left has been so weakened and demoralized itself after the fall of the Soviet Union, the left is not available at every street corner, saying this is the program for dignity, comrade. Don't go to them. Don't take that exit. That exit leads to an illusion. You'll be beating up your son-in-law. See, you've forgotten that your son-in-law is Mexican. When you went to the rally, the Nuremberg of the 21st century, you got excited when he said the Mexicans are taking. You forgot that now you don't live in that kind of society. Your children are dating, you know, somebody from, I don't know, Canada. You know, and of all horrors, you know, you forgot that, comrade. Don't go down that exit. Take the next exit, comrade. The next exit is better. But if we want to take that next exit, comrade, we have to bring 20 more people. We have to build our movements. Because our movements will give us confidence. What do workers want more than anything else? It's dignity and confidence. It's not money. Money is nothing. You give somebody more money, they'll kill you with inflation. What you want is dignity. What you want is confidence. What you want is your children to feel like the future is theirs. That's what you want. You need a political party for that. You can't just have an amorphous movement. You go for one big mobilization, another mobilization, and then you feel dead after that. Because you know what's good about our movement, what used to be good about our movement? It was not just a political movement, it was a social movement. Yeah. You would gather as friends together. You would meet at a union hall. You would meet at a community center. You would have picnics together. You understood that the point of it was to build your own confidence with each other. When you meet on the street, you feel good to be alive. Even if you can't find a job and you're starving, you treat each other with dignity. See how today one worker will look at another, oh, you're unemployed, sorry about that. You know, I've got to go for my job. Those divisions should not exist. It's a cultural struggle for us. So that's why I say very much that, you know, you have to create a political force. You know, you have this city, Troy, Albany, these are important towns to wage a political battle on behalf of the people. And I don't mean electorally. I mean a political battle on behalf of the people. You have a man who's your attorney general, I think, or whatever, who participated in a cover-up of a police shooting. Okay? Vindicated apparently recently. I was listening on the radio. I don't know anything about this case. But the hearts of a lot of people must have sunk when they heard that the case didn't go forward. We should be on the street, going to people, raising the confidence of people. That's all I'm talking about. You see, what I mean is, when you're in despondency, demoralized, the answer to that isn't changing policy. Getting Obama elected so he doesn't change policy. That's not the answer. The answer is to build a society. Because we don't have a society. And the ruling class is not going to build a society for you. Their purpose is to atomize you, to destroy your society, to make it impossible for you to gather anywhere, to send the police after you because they say, why are three of you standing together? Curfew, I mean those laws in Chicago where three people who look like gang members cannot gather. Really? What does that even mean? Yes, please.
I'm thinking of the dilemma that factory workers making munitions are valued on at a different level from nurses' aides that are changing bed sheets of patients. In the long view of history, the latter are more needed and doing more constructive work, but they're pitted against the munitions maker. And the munitions maker have been very carefully distributed into every congressional district in America. How do you reshuffle those cards without splintering the common interest of valuing the individual contribution to a decent society?
See, I mean, one thing, it's a very important question. One thing that I would say, if I was involved in building a political organization in America, I'd say, let us go among munition workers and see what their attitude really is. Because I'm not sure the munition workers actually take a position against, say, caregivers. I think that's how the bourgeois media would perhaps do it. In other words, let's think about the gendering of it. Let's say largely munitions workers are men, largely. Largely caregivers are women, largely. There are exceptions. I would bet that many munitions workers' wives are caregivers. Many munition workers, male munition, their wives are caregivers. I bet. I bet that they come from similar class, if not the wife, then the cousin, then the mother, then the nurse, then, you know, somebody, the whatever, the sister, somebody. I bet there is more basis of class solidarity there than we expect. But you need a political party that understands sexism as well, that understands that the male worker with a hard hat does not define worker, and understands that both are workers and works against, does not reinforce sexism in society, but fights against it. So what I would say is, if we were building a political party, the first thing I would do is to go amongst the workers and learn their attitudes before I lecture them.
Right.
Because they may not hold those attitudes. We don't know that. I don't know, maybe others know better than I. But I would say the first principle of union organizing always is to see what the workers think, correct? Yeah. You've got to see what the workers think. And once you're immersed yourself in the workers' ideology, you can then produce a program. So I don't know, but I feel that there would be the basis because of the family issue. That they come from the same class background. They must come from same families. Yeah.
I think that women, whether it's the teachers in these states all over the country that went out in mass numbers, the nurses at Albany Med, where they finally got their union and their contract, that we're seeing more of this led by women than I'm seeing with men. So many of these unions, whose members are overwhelmingly women, seem to be much more militant and willing to take risks. And I'd like your thoughts on that.
Well, it's interesting that we come here today, meaning to the point of women leading struggles and being militant. After all, the revolution against the Tsarist Empire starts on International Women's Day.
Right.
And it was the women's, socialist working women's march in Petrograd, that where the women called out to the factory workers and said, come and join us, and people came in hundreds. So this idea of women's militancy is a very historical one. In fact, so many of the hardcore Bolshevik organizers were women. You know, Lenin writes about this. You know, it's a question of gender and how things are remembered, the gendered nature of history. than how things are remembered. You know, in the book I quote from the strike call that comes from the women's group, and it's quite interesting because, you know, this is in Petrograd, 1917. Comrades, working women, for whose sake is a war waged? Do we need to kill millions of Austrian and German workers and peasants? German workers did not want to fight either. Then it goes on. Ministers, mill owners and bankers hope to fish in troubled waters. They become rich in wartime. After the war, they will not pay military taxes. Dear women comrades, will we keep on tolerating this silently for very long with occasional outbursts of boiling? I mean, these are the women in the Bolshevik party that came out most militantly. There's a section here where I quote how Lenin is sitting in his office and a bunch of women workers, they come from a strike and they come to him and say, you know, Comrade Lenin, we want you, let me find it, this is so good. They say, you know, we want you to take power. Here. These are Concordia Natasha Somilova, Emilia Solnin from the Avis plant, the spinner Vasina from the Nikata factory, Vinogradova from the Basili Island pipe factory. These were the militants. They were hard-working women, factory workers and militant revolutionists. They wanted to overthrow the government of Kerensky. So they marched to see Lenin in the Smolny, where he lived and worked. Take power, Comrade Lenin. That is what we working women want, they said to him. Lenin replied, it is not I, but you, the workers, who must take power. Return to your factories and tell the workers that. And that's what they did. So this idea of women's militancy is a very old idea. And I think it's an important idea. And I think people need to recognize the history in order to understand today. You see what I mean? This is not a product of, say, the women's movement. This is the nature of working class struggles. For many reasons, which there are too many to multiply, working class struggles often push women in front. Now they don't get the credit or take leadership. That's sexism. That's a separate issue. That doesn't mean they're not there. Because they don't take credit or get leadership doesn't mean they don't exist. So it's a very old story and we need to recognize that. I mean, what else is there to say? Yeah, please.
Yeah, you talked about a lot about, you know, building a movement, that we need to build a movement. The poor people campaign, you know, they say that they're building a movement, but they only talk about the moral aspect. I'd like to know what's your view of that. And also, Labor kind of have not gotten involved in that campaign. You know, so I would like to know how you feel about that. What should be the role of Labor, or what should be the role of the left in that campaign?
That's a good question. I mean, I think Reverend Barber, Liz, Theo Harris, these people are radicals. You know, let's be clear. These are radical people. I mean, they have a. Did you see Reverend Barber at the Democratic National Convention? I mean, he was amazing. He was the only interesting person who spoke there. It's really amazing. You know, he really laid the marker down at the DNC convention. You know, but I think that this is an important movement, and I would feel that all political groups would support it fully. I mean, the point isn't sectarianism. The point is you're looking for a vehicle to reach people, to build their confidence, correct? And, you know, there's got to be something said about this country and religion. I mean, maybe this is the road that you go down initially. You know, after all, King was deeply radicalized after 66, 67, 68. I mean, I don't know, one of my favorite books by Martin Luther King is Where Do We Go From Here? Which is written after the uprising in Watts, where King is confronted by the militancy of, you know, the black proletariat in the United States. And he comes back from Los Angeles and he writes, where do we go from here? It's a very important book. Because he's trying to both deal with the fact that he's, you know, finally listening to his communist advisors, you know, who surrounded him. The FBI was correct. They were all communists. You know, their fantasy was correct, from Bayard Rustin out to, you know, all of them really. One side he says they are now correct, right? The other side he says this militancy has to be dealt with. But he's worried about the militancy. So he says, let's launch the Poor People's Campaign. And he deepens that by a critique of imperialism. Now he calls it militarism. It's interesting, it's not semantic. Huh? he calls it militarism. It's a very interesting thing that is there. He says the triplets of militarism, racism and poverty, I think, are the triplets.
Okay.
Right? Okay, not imperialism, militarism and poverty. And Babur in some senses has picked up that flag. And I think everybody should rally around that flag, see where it goes. You know, as the guy asked, why are you running as a Democrat? And he gave the best line, you know, ever. He said, I'll ride this donkey as far as it'll go. Which I thought is the most clear philosophical attitude towards politics, you know. So, you know, the flag of the Poor People's Movement has come to Albany. Why don't you rally around it? What else is there? You know, why take a sectarian position? Go with it. See, develop, reach out to people. You know, in the Indian freedom struggle, it was called the mass contact movement. You know, we need a mass contact movement. You got to go door to door. Reach out to people. Comrade, don't be depressed. Don't go for opiates. Don't go for suicide. Don't go for social malignancy. There's an alternative. You know, it's the good news. Socialism is the ultimate good news. Somebody in the back, yeah. You have to enunciate.
Project your voice.
I want to know your point of view on the Kashmir militancy and the insurgency that's brought to
On what?
Kashmir militancy.
Kashmir militancy. You know, I wrote something about it recently because a friend of mine was killed last week. His name was Shujat Bukhari. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He was the editor of a magazine and a newspaper in Kashmir called Kashmir Rising, and we were colleagues together in the Hindu and in Frontline. He was our correspondent in Jammu and Kashmir. It was a very sad thing for all of us. He was a very brave and noble person. I was very, you know, quite shattered by his death. He, you know, wrote with great feeling, I think, about the struggles, and in the last few months wrote with great honesty about what's happening in Kashmir. You know, as I've said a number of times, that when you have 700,000 troops, Indian troops, in the Kashmir Valley, supposed to go after what the Indian government says are 150 militants, that's a very odd ratio. You know, I mean, do you really need 700,000 troops to go after? So, you know, if you put 700,000 people into a small area, they're going to attack civilians. That's inevitable. I mean, everybody knows that. And, you know, when Kaisar Bhatt was killed by the jeep recently, I don't know if you saw the story, he was run over by Indian military jeep, deliberately. He was 20 years old. He left behind two sisters, one age 16, one age 11. And, you know, his sisters were very moving in talking about him. They said, what will happen to us now? And the reason they asked the question is important. He had said before he, you know, when he was a little younger, maybe 18 or so, I'm going to stop studying so that I can take a job, so that my sisters can study, age 16 and 11 now. And so he worked to support them. They lived with the uncle and aunt because their parents had died. And then he's dead. And so they say, what will happen to us? Now really the question that my colleague Shudat had written, I mean written with great feeling about, as I said, the real question after you read the story of somebody like Kaisar Bhatt is not, why did he become a militant? But the real question is, why doesn't every young person become a militant? Because the conditions are such. You know, and the conditions don't seem to be changing at any point. So that's how I understand the situation of Kashmir, you know, that until and unless, you know, there is also a political, you know, opening in Kashmir, which is also going to be difficult. You know, you have 700,000 troops, you have internal Kashmiri politics, again, as he wrote about in Frontline, very fraught, you know, very difficult to produce an agenda. Until you have some, I think, genuine discussion between India and Pakistan, because they are important players in both Indian Kashmir and Pakistani Kashmir. Until all these things happen, this is just going to continue. And then you'll ask the question again, you know, why did he become a militant? No, why doesn't everybody become a militant, you know? And so I think that's a terrible thing. I mean, you know, we have a member of the Legislative Assembly from our political party, Mohammed Yusuf Tarigami, from the town of Kulgram. And you know, Tarigami has been very brave. I mean, he takes a position very much against the Indian government and the militants. But of course, he gets attacked because he criticizes the militants, you know. Because you're supposed to have a particular position. I find every politics, when you suffocate into a position, is wrong. You got to have some space for debate, you know. That's how you rejuvenate political debate in a society that's virtually under occupation. So I think it's unfortunate, and the killing of my colleague and friend was most likely done either by the state or a militant group. You know, nobody else is going to do the one or the other. And in a sense, both are going to suffocate politics. And I think that's a real problem, you know. Yes, one and then two. Yeah.
My question, I mean, you before you mentioned, and you talked about sort of the political conflicts, or geopolitical conflicts, and sort of after, you know, American intention, North Korea, Libya, Syria, but one that seems to consistently always escape our, you know, our attention is Yemen. Yeah. Just last week, I think it was announced the Saudi-led coalition was making that last drive into the port city there to really put the bow on the military, you know, sort of enforced famine there. Yeah. This just horrible, you know, famine that's, you know, underway. And I was just wondering if you could comment on the situation, the crisis, and what I just, it seemed no one seems to care what good, what anything can really come. You speak about demoralization. It's like here that is being policed. What next?
I mean, Yemen is not a tragedy. Yemen is a crime scene.
Yeah.
You know, and you know, the Saudis and the UAE, the Emiratis, have, as you know, been given a green light by the West. I mean, you're continuing to rearm them.
Yeah.
And despite the fact that every agency of the United Nations has said there's going to be famine, disease, you know, the 6 horsemen of the apocalypse have ridden up and down Yemen non-stop, you know, for the last 3 years. Sure, all that is true. It's also true, of course, that there have been people trying to raise, you know, Code Pink does certain things and so on. It's important. People have been. Some people in the US Congress, in fact, have tried to raise discussions and so on. These things have been happening as well. It's not that nobody has. In Britain, more advanced than the United States on this, they've started a campaign against the arms manufacturers. You know, the particular ones that are rearming the war in Yemen. The port of Hodeidah, which you mentioned, 75% or so of food comes into Yemen from that port. And if the Emiratis capture it, which is likely, they'll close the port and starve the country. I mean, they don't care about the Yemenis. They see them as vermin anyway. And the West is knee-deep in them. I mean, this is a genocidal war. Millions of people are going to die, starvation, cholera already is unbelievable in Yemen, cholera and so on. Fine, all that is fine. What are you supposed to do about it? I mean, the target in the United States is always the weapons dealers.
Yes.
Always. You know, weapons dealers always. And, you know, it would be useful for somebody, and I'm not sure if Code Pink has done it, to make a list of the weapons manufacturers. And make a list of the CEOs. And put their faces somewhere. That these are the people who are, you know, making money off the dead children of Yemen. But it's also instructive, by the way, it's also instructive that Yemen is only one piece of a regional war between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
That's it.
And until the Saudis and the Iranians sit at a table and have a grand bargain, you know, it is possible. Until they have a grand bargain, because the Saudis are backed into a corner. The economy is in tailspin. This young idiot crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, he doesn't know what he's doing, plagiarizing from McKinsey for his Saudi 2020 report. You know what I mean? Is that they are also in a bad shape. You know, oil prices are rising now, it will give them some relief, but they're in a bad shape. So until there is actually some grand bargain between Tehran and Riyadh, these wars are going to continue. You know, Saudi-Iranian war in Syria, for instance, which is, it's genuine, you know, whatever you say, the Russians are there to protect their warm water port in Tartus, for sure. The Iranians are there because they don't want the Saudis to take Damascus. This is all on the surface, guys. You know, all this talk about like it's a revolution, or on the other side, it's Assad is a hero, I mean, it's all nonsense. It boils down to the fact that Syria has become irrelevant for Syrians. It's a regional Cold War. That's really what it is. The Syrian people are irrelevant. Nobody cares about the Syrian people. It's about who's going to control the road, for instance, that runs from the Iranian border to Beirut. The Americans fought hard in southeastern Syria to prevent the Iranians from taking control of the road. They failed. So why is that road important? It means Iran can directly by road, much cheaper and easier, resupply Hezbollah. Much cheaper and easier. They will resupply Hezbollah by road. You don't have to fly in planes, Israelis detect the planes and then bomb the trucks. Now hundreds of trucks will come. Some will be carrying, I don't know, chiclets. Some will be carrying missiles, You don't know who's carrying a missile. You can't bomb all the trucks. Okay, so it's about that. This is a real set of complicated relations. Those who believe you can look at the Syrian war from the prism of freedom, unfreedom, they don't know what they're talking about. They've never traveled to Syria, firstly. It's amazing. I mean, I read some of these American writers who write on Syria. I mean, until yesterday, they didn't know where Syria was. Now they are experts at it, And the funny thing is, they keep saying, these are mainly white men, they will keep saying, we need to hear from the Syrians. But actually, they are speaking the most. I mean, it's extraordinary. If you're going to say, let's hear from the Syrians, why don't you be quiet then? And why are you picking which Syrians should be heard? See, that's the other thing. You're now saying this Syrian is good. They are ventriloquizing your nonsense. You are the puppet master. This is the old white man's game. Sorry, I'm using very reactionary Native American language, okay? White man speaks very dangerously. Yes. Oh, yeah, maybe let's go to the gentleman in the back. He had his hand first. We'll come back down. Yeah.
Just one more. And then
one more
maybe
question.
Maybe a few words
fine.
about the book after.
Okay, yeah.
I was thinking as you spoke of, filling the streets with people and all that. A few years ago, there was the Occupy movement, which of course spread outside of the country, but it was very, at least numerously attended in the country. And I thought of questions and parallels between some of the things you were saying, but I guess maybe I just will ask you, what sense did that movement make to you? What sense does it make? And does it still somehow exist? Did it do anything worthwhile?
You see, sir, I can't answer the second part of your question. But the first part I can answer because my old editor, Alexander Coburn, sent me to cover some Occupy sites. He phoned me up, as he sometimes did, and he said, why don't you go to 6 to 8 Occupy sites? So I went to Chicago, I went to Boston, I went to New York, I went to Philadelphia, I've forgotten now even, sorry. I think maybe Atlanta, Georgia, and I wrote a series for them on the Occupy movement. And I found a couple of features of that. First, one thing, just in terms of what I was saying earlier, is, you see, why should people go and hang out in one place? The point is to go door to door in your neighborhood. You have to bring people to the street, not go and sit in one place and say, like what's that biblical thing? You don't go up the mountain, you bring the mountain to whatever. What's it, Abraham and the thing, you go up and something or the other. You can't expect the mountain to come to Muhammad.
Yeah, that's
You got to go to what's it. So, you can't sit in like downtown Albany and say, we're here. Well, your neighbors in Troy don't understand, and they're watching you on TV and you look like a bunch of bedraggled people with a million odd duck signs. They have not been politically prepared for this. They don't know how to understand you. You look like hippies, They're not sure what this is all about. So, in a sense, what I'm talking about is not really occupy somewhere distant, but go to your people. I visited John's house today. You have a neighborhood. We go to the people there, not go somewhere else and say, come with me. Why should they follow you? They don't have any clue who you are. Why should they come? And I found that very much. And I also found, second thing, people gathered there and then they seemed to make their occupation the politics. What is your politics? What's the agenda? they created a very interesting culture. I envied it. I thought it was quite interesting. Democratic discussions, all those things were fantastic. But what's the next step? There was very little attention to strategy. I went to several of these public meetings, especially in the New York one. All the discussions were about logistics. Many of the discussions, not all. Don't use the Starbucks toilet. Go to the toilet over here. They've allowed us to come. And then, don't. Use. I mean, it was extraordinary. What was the strategy? Who stood up there and said, this is what we should do next? We need to occupy the mayor's house, or until this, what was your demand? We demand the overthrow of capitalism. Really? Guys, it doesn't work like that. You've got to build the power of people's confidence. You can only overthrow capitalism in a big mass movement that, marches on the White House and tells, what's his name to get abducted by his fellow aliens. And then, we can return, or rather, maybe make a new house there, not that house. And make that into,
a green.
Yeah, maybe you can make the White House into a, I don't know, place of reflection. Where people can come and, something like that. Or you just raise it and build the house of the people.
Right.
Whatever. But you need a mass movement. You can't just say we've come to abolish capitalism.
Right.
The Occupy movement had the best science. And that was very interesting. That showed actually the revolutionary impulses slumber in people. It was a little bit like the kind of early moment of the Soviet Revolution where Mayakovsky wrote these great poems and so on. There was a cultural something there that needs to be absorbed. There are revolutionary impulses in the people. They exist. But you have to build movements. Don't expect them to just appear, Okay, very quickly, I brought these two books for you to take a look at there. They are from our press, Leftward Books, which is based in New Delhi. Now, these books are all very short for a reason. We believe that we as left-wing, as communists and so on, Marxists, need to produce books that people will read. It's the responsibility of the socialist writer, we believe, to distill a vast amount of information and not show the reader that they're smart. Don't have to write this big book on the Russian Revolution. This is my book on the Russian Revolution. From the Third World. It's got the whole story. But you should be able to read it and get a sense of what's happening. Not get the whole thing. The reason I wanted Eve Ensler to write on Trump and not say David Harvey or, some respected Marxist is I was interested in the imagination. I wanted somebody with a fierce imagination, a theatrical imagination, to get under the skin of Trump. I wanted to feel what the temperature is like just under his skin. I wasn't interested in a critique of his politics, because guess what? Everybody knows what that is. That's boring, That's a list of he's a jerk, whatever, racist, sexist guy, wants to, do this, that, he's incoherent, doesn't understand trade. I mean, come on, that's fine. But what does it mean that this, what she called a man with orange hair, is now the ruler of this country? What does that mean? What does that say about America? That's the real question. So small books, no need for giant tomes. If you're interested, you can go to the library and read those. We don't sell those books. Finally, I brought these, and I have some if you're really interested. This is a book. We are going to produce more and more of these. This is a book about the farmers' long march. The farmers of Maharashtra marched 190 kilometers. Tens of thousands of them. And this is a book. The first essay is written by one of the farmer leaders. And the second essay is written by my colleague. He goes and visits a rally. And it has beautiful pictures. And it documents this very important communist farmers movement rally. And they defeated the right-wing government in Maharashtra. It's a very right-wing government. They forced the government through their struggle to concede. And they did something very interesting. They entered Bombay in the middle of the night. They were going to pitch camp at the edge of Bombay. They heard then that the next day were the class 10 exams for the young children of Bombay. Class 10 exams for the young children. So they decided to march all night so as not to disturb the children when they go to their exams the next day. And that was a gesture of communism. You know, a humane communist gesture. And it was that gesture that won the middle class to them. Because the middle class said, these farmers are concerned about our children. And it got mass support. So I have these very little books. I have also, I can put them out if you're interested. To enjoy reading our books. We plan to become the best left-wing publisher in the world. So your help would be much appreciated.
Yes.
And on that shopkeeperish note, thanks a lot.